Are you receiving me? Nod. Yes, great. Okay. Um, thank you all for joining us. Thanks, Doug McLean from Groam House Museum. We're up here in the Highlands. I'm in Strathpeffer. It's been a beautiful day, and hope you've had a good day too. Groam House Museum is about half an hour to the east of where I am. The museum is dedicated to the culture of the Pictish people who were up here in the Highlands before the Romans came and before the Scots came over from Ireland and, as it were, made Scotland what it is. The Picts, they disappeared from the historical records about 1,200 years ago. They didn't leave any written literature that we know about, but they did leave some wonderful carved stones. And if you want to see some of those stones, one of the places to go is Groam House Museum. Now then, water is actually, it's called 3 ginger, good for throats. Water is the theme of this year's Scottish International Storytelling Festival, to whom and the Tracks organisation thanks for funding this event. And I'm going to begin by trying to invoke the spirit of one of the most famous Scottish storytellers of all time. I'm just reaching here for the Moothy. His name was Duncan Williamson. He was born in 1928, according to his own account, in a tent in the middle of a wood by the shores of Loch Fyne down in Argyll. And Duncan died 13 years ago, almost to the day, from really quite remarkable beginnings. He travelled all over the world telling stories. Didn't just tell stories, he sang songs, modern comic songs, ancient ballads. He used to ask riddles. For example, I can ask you a riddle. Now it's hard. Riddle asking isn't really a great thing for Zoom, but who cares? As I looked out across the bay, I saw the dead carry the living away. Now, don't all unmute. I'll just say it once more and give you the answer, because we don't have the time to go round the houses. So, as I looked out across the bay, I saw the dead carry the living away. And the answer is, of course, a boat. Because the wood that the boat is made from, or the metal or whatever, is dead. And whoever's on the boat is, we hope, alive. So here's Duncan telling stories, asking riddles, singing songs, and also he played music on a variety of instruments. And quite often during his act, when he wanted to get the audience to join in, he would say to them, "Now, my friends, you've all heard of the bonny, bonny banks of Loch Lomond. Well, I'd like to take you on a little trip there." And then he would get his Moothy, his harmonica, and he would play the tune of the Bonny Bonny Banks, and he would exhort the audience to join in. So if you're out there sitting at home by the fire and fancy a bit of a sing, let's have a couple of verses of the Bonny Bonny Banks. And we'll meet Duncan again later on, at the very end of the show, in fact. But now, the first story. It's about an Irishman. We know him as Columcille, the dove of the church, or perhaps Saint Columba. Columba was a monk who came over from Ulster in 563 AD, and he established a monastery on the island of Iona to the very far west of Argyll, west of the island of Mull, and his mission was to bring the Christian message to the heathen Picts. One day, Columba set off with a handful of monks for the east to try and convert King Brude, who lived in a fortress somewhere near where Inverness is today. And he probably would have travelled, this is Columba, in a boat, a bit like the one that St. Brendan used on his famous voyages. A wicker frame, covered in cowhide, tanned with oak bark, sealed with butter, and with the seams sealed with pitch. They would have gone around probably the north of the island of Mull, then by the island of Lismore and into the mouth of the Great Glen, near where Fort William is today, and up the Great Glen by the huge waterways until they came to the vast stretch of water that's Loch Ness, and at the far eastern end of Loch Ness was where King Brude had his fortress. And by the way, it's recorded that in the mouth of the River Ness, when he was visiting Brude, Columba encountered a water beast, which had actually eaten somebody not long before. And Columba vanquished the beast with his great powers, and this is often said to be the first recorded meeting with the famous Loch Ness monster. Anyway, Columba approaches Brude's fortress. Brude sees him coming, but decides not to let him in. So after a bit, when Columba realizes that he's being rejected, he goes up to the big wooden gates and he makes the sign of the cross, and the gates swing open as if by magic. After which point, of course, Brude has to give Columba a bit more respect than he showed him before. Columba's greatest resistance that Columba meets is from King Brude's priests. They're sometimes called magicians, the priests of the long-forgotten gods of the Picts. And the leader of these priests was a man called Broichen. And Broichen kept a slave woman. And she was Irish, like Columba. And Columba told Broichen he should give the woman her freedom. Broichen, of course, refused. So sometime towards the end of their visit to Inverness, Columba and his monks are on the banks of the Ness. Suddenly Columba says, Broichen has just been struck by an angel. He's clutching his chest. He's falling to the ground. And Brude is sending messengers to ask me if I can help do anything about this terrible situation. And he picked up a white stone, a pebble, from the banks of the Ness. And he gave it to one of the young monks, and he said, when the messengers come from Brude, go back, tell the king to put this white stone in a vessel of water. Then if Broichen agrees to give up the slave woman and drinks from the water, he'll be spared. Otherwise, he'll be dead before we go back to Iona. He'd hardly finished speaking when there was a sound of horses' hooves clattering on the stones on the banks of the Ness. The young monk went with the messengers. Brood did as Columba had told him. Broyachan agreed to give up the slave woman. He drank from the water, and he was cured. And Brood hung on to the stone. He used it many times after that to cure people of all kinds of ailments. But there was one person the stone couldn't cure. On the day that Brood died, the white pebble disappeared and was never seen again. I'm just going to play a little bit of music here because one of the things that we find it hard to figure out is the kind of music that people played and listened to in prehistoric times. And it just happens that on the famous Pictish stones, there are a couple of carvings of people playing instruments pretty much like this. This is a double pipe. The Picts played triple pipes, but the sound is pretty much the same. So Columba might have heard a sound a bit like this when he was staying in Bru's fortress. Well, we're going to leave Inverness now. We're going east to the Black Isle, past Rosemarkie, where Groam House Museum is, on the banks of the Murray Firth. Further east still to the little port of Cromarty. And then over the Cromarty Firth onto the Nig Peninsula. Going north now past Nig Church, where there's a great example of a late Pictish cross slab carved after the Picts were converted to Christianity, and then up to the seaboard villages on the very east coast of Easter Ross. Hilton, the hill town. Ballantor, in Gaelic, the place where the people do the bleaching, and Shandwick, Old Norse, the language of the Vikings, the sandy beach, the sandy bay. And that's where I moved when I came to live in the Highlands 31 years ago, almost to the day. I went to the village of Hilton, stay in a little fisherman's cottage on the shore. In fact, it was called Number 1 Shore Street. And in my garden there was a shed. The man who built the shed had used it to build a boat. And when he built the boat, he sailed around the world in it rather wonderfully. I turned it into a recording studio. And one bright summer's day, I was sitting in the door of the studio and I was playing my melodeon. I'm going to show you the very instrument. Here it is. This is the melodeon that I was playing. I'm not going to play it because there's a danger I might knock the microphone over. So what I'll do is I'll play you the tune on the Muthi that I was playing. I remember the tune I was playing when I was sitting in the door of that workshop. And while I was playing, I saw coming up the little path between the gardens and the shore towards me a woman. And she had a little white dog with her. And the dog I later discovered was called Mac. And When the woman got closer, she heard the sound of the music, and she began to dance on the path. I carried on playing, and when I'd finished, she said, she said, the old melodeon. My mother used to have one of those things. And when she played, we children used to dance to the music. And I discovered that this was the famous Dolly. Dolly was renowned throughout the seaboard and further afield for knowing all the stories and the legends of the place. She told me many stories, and there was one in particular that really took my fancy. Because although I knew it was an old story and told in lots of different places, Dolly told it as if it had happened just a couple of months ago. So here's Dolly MacDonald's story of the young man who used to live in Shandwick. And he was a solitary character. He wasn't married, didn't have children. He very much would have liked to have them, but he didn't fancy anybody around there. Nobody much fancied him, so there he was in his little cottage, a fisherman, a lonely fisherman. One day he was walking down the Shandwick beach, and he saw ahead of him, in the distance, a figure sitting on a stone with its back to him. As he got closer, he saw that whoever it was had masses of golden hair, and it was spread over the back of the rock. He got closer still, and he saw, to his amazement, swishing very slowly and gracefully around the bottom of the rock, a big, fishy tail. And he thought to himself, I can't believe this. I think it's a mermaid. I'd never seen a mermaid, but he'd heard they were very beautiful, and he wanted to find out. So he quickened his pace and came around the rock, and he caught the mermaid's eye. And she was, indeed, very beautiful. And he thought to himself, what a wife she would make. And then he thought of the practicalities. I would have to carry her about everywhere. She'd need to sleep in the bath. And then he remembered something. Dolly MacDonald, the wise woman of Hilton, had told him. If you ever see a mermaid sitting on a rock and you want her to lose her tail, walk around the rock 3 times, widdershins, anti-clockwise, and her tail will fall away and she'll have legs. So he thought it was worth a try. He walked around the rock 3 times, widdershins, and her tail did fall away. And he thought, how can I stop her going back to the sea, slipping it on, and away she goes? Then he had a bright idea. He grabbed the tail, he ran back to his cottage in Shandwick, ran down to the bottom of the garden, he folded the tail into a neat square parcel. It was very thin, like fish skin. He slipped it behind the plant pots, behind the lawnmower, where he thought she would never find it. And then he went back into the house, and he sat down at the kitchen table, and he picked up a copy of the Rossshire Journal, sat at the kitchen table, pretended to be reading it, but actually he was looking over the top, peeping down the road. And it wasn't long before he saw what he'd hoped for. The mermaid, swathed in seaweed. She came up the front path. There was a knock at the door. He went to the door. She said, please give me back my tail. I need it to get back to the sea. I've got family. I've got friends there. They'll be missing me. He said, before we do anything, why don't you come in? You look a bit chilled. I'll make some tea. And I'd love to have a chat about what it's like to live at the bottom of the sea. I've never met a mermaid before. And she had no choice. So she went in and sat at the table, discarded the seaweed, and he gave her a blanket to put round her. He made a pot of tea and he got some chocolate hobnobs out of the cupboard. They drank the tea and they ate the hobnobs. She liked the hobnobs. She'd never had chocolate hobnobs before. And they got on really well together. In fact, they got on so well, a couple of weeks later, they were married in the registry office in Tain, just up the road. And after they'd been married for about a year, she had a baby. And it was a little boy. And about a year after that, she had a second child. This time, it was a little girl. And a year after that, well, you've probably guessed, she had a third child. This time it was another little boy. And she was a wonderful mother. She was kind to the children. She looked after them. She loved them. And she was what in those days would have been called a good wife. When her husband got back from the fishing, there was always food on the table. The house was kept spick and span. But sometimes she became very sad. And when she was sad, she would go and sit on the little stool by the window, look out across the Murray Firth, and she would play a tune on a little bone flute, which was the only thing she brought with her from the sea. One day her husband asked her where the flute came from. She said it was from the bone in a leg of an old sea captain she used to know quite well. That was the only time he asked that question. Well, time went on. The oldest boy was at school, primary 1. The little girl, she was at nursery. And the little boy, the youngest boy, he was toddling around and saying lots and lots of words, some of which made sense and some of which didn't. One Sunday morning, the man woke, and there was no one next to him in the bed. But on the pillow, next to his, was the bone flute. He ran downstairs. Children were having breakfast. He asked them where their mother was. They said, "Oh, she's just had to pop out for a minute." He ran down to the shed at the bottom of the garden. He looked behind the plant pots, behind the lawnmower, and the tail had gone. Somehow she must have found out where it was, gone to the sea, put it back on, and away she'd gone. I never saw her again. Sometimes when they were walking along the beach, they would find on a stone 4 fresh fish still flapping from the sea, as if they were presents for the man and his 3 children. That's not quite the end of the story, because I do have to tell you at some point how I came by the little bone flute and who taught me how to play it and play the mermaid's tune. But we don't have time for that now, so that'll have to come on another occasion. Because now we're leaving the Nig Peninsula, going north again, over the Dornoch Firth, the mighty waters of the Dornoch Firth, carrying on north past Dornoch, Brora, Golspie, past Glenloth, where the last wolf in that part of the Highlands was killed, and Helmsdale, another great Viking name, leaving Sutherland and the Sutherland Mountains behind into the peatlands of Caithness, by the great Neolithic tombs, past Wick and on to John O'Groats, and then just a little bit further till we come to a headland which is called Duncansby Head. Now there's a lighthouse at Duncansby Head, and if you stand by the lighthouse and look north, you'll see the island of Stroma, and beyond that the southernmost islands of the Orkney archipelago. If you turn south and walk along the top of the cliff, you'll see the huge sea stacks, the famous Duncanby stacks, coming up out of the sea like great teeth. And a man used to have a cottage on the top of those cliffs. He was a man who killed seals for a living. He was a seal killer. When he killed the seals, he used to strip off the skins. He'd render down the blubber to make oil. And then he'd cure the skins, and he'd make items of clothing, mittens, waistcoats, rivlins, which were waterproof boots, much prized by fishermen, even little purses to keep money in. And every day he would go down the steep path from his cottage into the bay, push out his boat into the water, row out into the middle of the bay, and wait for the seals. And he always had a little silver whistle, and he would play a special tune on the silver whistle. It was a seal calling tune. And when they heard it, the seals would come up to listen. One day he was out in his boat playing the whistle when a huge seal broke the surface of the sea right by the boat. He put down his whistle. He picked up his bone-handled knife. He plunged it into the back of the seal, and the seal sunk down beneath the waves, taking the knife with it. The seal killer rowed to the shore. He climbed up the path to the top of the cliff. He went into his cottage. He sat down at the kitchen table, and he wondered where he could get another knife. He sat there all day. Into the evening there was a great storm. Sometime after midnight there was a knock at the door. He answered the door, and there stood a tall stranger with a big black cloak wrapped around him and a wide-brimmed black hat pulled down over his eyes. And he said, "Are you the man who cures sealskins?" He said, "Yes, I am. What do you want with me at this time of night?" He said, "I've a job for you. It pays well, but you have to come now." There was a flash of lightning, and the seal killer saw a huge black stallion just waiting patiently. The stranger mounted the stallion. He pulled the seal killer up behind him, and they rode off into the mouth of the night, till they reached the cliff edge, and then they dismounted. The stranger put his arms around the seal killer. He took a deep breath of air. He pressed his lips to the seal killer's lips. He breathed air into the seal killer's lungs. Then he threw himself off the cliff, with the seal killer still in his arms. Down they went like stooping hawks, till they hit the surface of the sea. They carried on sinking till they came to the ocean bed, and there was a door. They went through the door. They were in a hall full of round-faced, brown-eyed people. Many of them were weeping. The stranger led the seal killer to a smaller room, and there, lying on a bed of skins, was a beautiful woman. She was so pale and still, the seal killer couldn't tell whether she was alive or whether she was dead. And he saw, to his horror, that his bone-handled knife was embedded in her shoulder. The stranger said, "This is our queen, the queen of the Selkie people, and yesterday you stabbed her in the back, and now she's dying. You're the only one who could save her." "What should I do?" said the seal killer. "You must take out the knife and kiss the wound." Had no choice. He took out the knife, he leant forward, he kissed the wound, and the wound closed over as if by magic. The woman opened her eyes. She looked at the seal killer. He looked back at her, but before either of them could say anything, the stranger said, "Right, that's it. That's your job over. Come with me." He took the seal killer by the arm, led him back through the room full of the round-faced, weeping people. They came to the sea door. "Now," said the stranger, "before I let you go, promise me one thing." "What's that?" said the seal killer. "Promise me you will never, ever kill another seal." "No," he said, "I never will kill another seal." "Right," said the stranger, "take this." And he reached under his cloak, he pulled out a bundle, and he pressed it into the seal killer's hands. "And whatever you do, don't open it before you get back home." Then he opened the sea door. He pushed the seal killer out into the black waters. The door slammed behind him. Seal killer rose through the darkness till he thought his lungs would burst, and at last his head broke the surface of the sea, and there he was, in the bay, below the cliff where his cottage stood. And it was dawn. He floundered to the shore. He climbed up the steep path. He threw open the door of his cottage. He threw the bundle onto the kitchen table. It split open, and the room was full of pieces of gold. The seal killer never did kill another seal. He lived out his life in that little cottage on top of the cliff. He never married, never had children. But they say that when the moon was full and the sky was clear, he would go down to the beach and stand at the edge of the sea, and he would play a strange tune on a silver whistle. And after a while, out of the sea would come a huge seal, drag itself up onto the shingle, and then the seal would take off its skin, and out would step a beautiful woman. And all night long she and the seal killer would dance together on the sands in each other's arms under the light of the moon until dawn. Then at first light the woman would put her seal skin back on, and the seal killer would help her into the water. She would swim away. And this is a tune that the seal killer played to call the Queen of the Selkies out of the sea. That's the story of the seal killer of Duncansby Head. We're getting close to the end now. There's one story, and then we'll meet Duncan Williamson again. First of all, though, we're going over the sea to Denmark. This is a story that the Vikings knew, but it happens a long time before the Viking era. In Denmark, in those days, there was a king whose name was Frodi. And when Frodi ruled in Denmark, there was no crime. There were no muggings or murders or robberies. No fraud. It was so peaceful, it was known as Frodi's Peace. And in Frodi's palace, there was a huge circular room. And in the room, there was a giant mill. An old-fashioned mill, just 2 stones, one on top of the other, circular stones. It was called the Grotty Stone. Now, normally what would happen with a big quern mill like that is that there would be a hole in the top stone. You would put your grain in that hole. You would turn the top stone around on top of the bottom stone, and eventually flour would come out of a channel in the bottom stone. You could get flour from the Grotty Stone if you wanted to, but it was a magic mill. You could grind anything you wanted. So if you wanted horses, you just said, "Grind me horses," and horses would gallop out of the stone. Problem was, nobody in Denmark was strong enough to turn the Grotty Stone. Then one day, Frodi was in the palace of his friend, the Queen of Sweden, on a visit. And the Queen of Sweden kept slaves. And she had 2 giant slave girls. They were sisters. They were called Fenja and Menja. They really were giants. They were about 15 feet tall or more, I've been told. I wasn't there at the time, but I have it on good authority. And when Frodi cast his eye on Fenja and Menja, he thought to himself, "Those girls look strong enough to turn the Grotty Stone." So he bought them from the Queen of Sweden, had them shipped back to Denmark, had them taken to the room where the Grotty Stone lay inert. And he said, "Here you go, girls. See what you can do." So Fenja took the big wooden handle on one side of the stone. Menja took the big wooden handle on the other side of the stone, and they began to push. And there was a low, grinding noise. Very slowly, the Grotty Stone began to turn. Frodi said, "Grind me gold." Gold poured out of the Grotty Stone. Soon the room was full of gold. And the palace was full of gold, and Frodi was erecting great barns and warehouses to keep the gold in. Day after day, week after week, month after month, Fenja and Menja turned, and gold poured out of the stone. Then one day, they said, "Frodi, you've got a lot of gold. Could we stop? Just for a day, we're getting tired. Just a bit of a rest." Frodi said, "No, I want more gold." So Fenja and Menja kept on turning. A little while after that, they said again, "Frodi, please let us stop, just for an hour." Frodi said, "I tell you what, you can stop for as long as it takes the cuckoo to sing his song." Well, as you'll know, the cuckoo's song is very short. It goes cuckoo, and that's the end of it. So Fenja and Menja took this as a no. They kept on grinding. But in the middle of the night, they began to sing a song which became known as the Grotty Song. Frodi is a wicked king, grind, grind the grotty stone. We don't want to grind his gold, grind, grind the grotty stone. Grind an army against Frodi, and that's what they did. They ground out an army. The army was led by a king called Mising. Mising and his warriors landed in longboats on the shore of the beach below the cliff where Frodi had his palace. They alighted. They moved over the shingle like cats. They climbed the cliffs as if their bodies had no weight at all, and they stood facing Frodi's palace. And there were no guards. They weren't needed. It was Frodi's peace. So Mising and his men went up the great steps, through the big oak doors, into the marble hall. Mising went up the stairs, along the corridor to the very last room. The door was slightly ajar. He just touched it with his finger, and the door swung open. And there, lying on a bed of solid gold, sleeping Frodi's peace, was King Frodi himself. Mising took his axe, and with one Frodi's head was off. Mising took Fenja and Menja and the grotty stone. He put them on board his ship, and he began to set sail across the sea to the northeast coast of Scotland. When they were in the boat, Mising said to Fenja and Menja, "Grind me salt," because in those days salt was a precious commodity. So Fenja and Menja began to grind. About halfway across, the boat was so low in the water with the weight of the salt, Fenja and Menja said, "Mising, got lots of salt, but if we grind much more, the boat will sink." Mising said, "Grind me more salt. None of your lip, more salt." So they kept on grinding, till they came to the Pentland Firth, just by the island of Stroma, and there the boat sank. And where the boat sank today is a whirlpool. It's called the Selkie. And if you sail close enough to the Selkie, not too close, but close enough, and listen carefully, you might be able to hear from the ocean's bed two voices singing. "Mising is a wicked king, grind, grind the grotty stone. We don't want to grind for him, grind, grind the grotty stone." Because at the bottom of the ocean, Fenja and Menja are still grinding. And that's why there's a whirlpool by the island of Stroma. It's caused by the waters of the sea being drawn into the hole in the middle of the grotty stone as it turns. And that's also why, if you take a handful of seawater and put it to your lips and drink, it tastes of salt. I said we'd meet Duncan Williamson once more. Remember, Duncan was born in a tent. By the way, he claimed to have 16 brothers and sisters, not all living in the tent at the same time, but quite a few of them. Some of them would have been off already by the time Duncan was born to seek their fortunes. In a tent in the middle of a wood by the shores of Loch Fyne. And in the spring, the Williamsons would pack all their belongings onto the back of a horse and cart, and they would set off around the shores of Loch Fyne doing seasonal work, picking the whelks from the rocks, anything that they could do to get a bit of cash together for the winter. And when the autumn came, they would go back to the clearing in the forest. They would set up the tent with a stove inside, and they would winter there. And the children would go to the school in a little village called Furness, right by the edge of Loch Fyne. And when Duncan first went to school when he was 5, his head teacher in Furness School, Miss McFarlane, realised that he was having problems learning his ABC. So she said to him, "Duncan, I tell you what, I'll make a deal with you. If you promise me to learn your ABC, I'll teach you how to play one of these." And she pulled out of her desk drawer this article here, sometimes called a Jew's harp or a jaw harp. In India, it's called a morsing. In Germany, it's called a Maultrommel, a mouth drum, I think that is. In Siberia, where there are some wonderful players, it's called a chomus. But in Scotland, it's generally called a trump. That's it, a trump. And it has a little spring thing here, which is the business end of it. Duncan was very keen to learn to play one of these. So he learned his ABC. And Miss McFarlane taught him what to do with the trump. She said, first of all, you have to put it between your lips against your teeth. And just make the little spring, probably hear it actually. Yeah, you can hear that? Good. Make the little spring, go back and forth with your thumb. So he tried that. Very good, said Miss McFarlane. Be careful not to put your teeth together because the spring will rattle against them. Keep them slightly apart. Now, she said, move your tongue up and down in your mouth and see if you can get some different sounds. So Duncan tried that. Very good, said Miss McFarlane. Now, breathe in and out when you're playing as if you're a dog panting to make some rhythms. Excellent, she said. Now put all those things together and you might be able to play a bit of a tune. So Duncan tried. I've seen Duncan perform many times, and he nearly always told that story. And when he told it, he would always make the trump say the ABC. So I'm going to do that for you. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y, Z. And finally, I just want to say goodbye to you using the trump. It's quite hard to say goodbye, so I'll say hello instead, just to show you the sort of sounds it makes when it's talking. Those of you who are my kind of generation may remember on children's favourites, Sparky and the Magic Piano. And there's some speculation as to whether, in fact, the sound of the magic piano was one of these. But here we go. Hello,
everybody. How are you? Are you okay? Nice to see you all. Thank you for listening. Cheerio.
So, thanks everybody. Thanks for listening. Cheerio, and just look after yourselves.